These steps certainly have seen better days, but it's gotten good use out of it. I just wanted to revamp it in another fun way. We're using this thin tile, which has corners as well as flat pieces, to completely transform this entire look. But first, we need to grind off this paint.
In order to grind off this old paint quickly, effectively, and safely, we're going to be using this 7-inch grinder with a diamond cupping wheel along with a dust shroud that's connected to my shop vac. That means that once we're actually abrading the surface, all that dust, or at least the vast majority of it, is being collected into the shop vac. But keep in mind that I'm still wearing eye protection, ear protection, a respirator, and gloves just so we have some proper PPE while doing this grinding process. I certainly don't want to breathe in any of the silica dust that's being created from the paint and the concrete. I busted out my 4.5-inch grinder with the same cupping wheel and dust shroud to get into those really tight nitty-gritty areas, and for some reason, this actually abraded the surface even better than my larger grinder. I don't know why. It could have been the extension cord that I was using, and it wasn't providing the appropriate amount of power to the larger grinder, so just remember that just because it's bigger, in this case, doesn't mean that it's better. If you're wondering why we're prepping the surface like this, it's because we're going to be applying a thin set directly to the concrete. And in order to have a proper secure bond between our tile, or in this case our brick, to the concrete surface, we need a proper bond. Bonding thin set directly to latex paint is never going to be a good idea, especially long term, and especially in areas where you're going to have a lot of foot traffic like this area. The dust shroud that I'm using on both grinders has a removable side, which means you can get very close to the edge of where you're needing to grind to, but just know that's going to get a little bit dustier in those locations because you don't have a perfect seal that wraps all the way around your grinding head. With the landing and stair risers taken care of, I move on to the risers. And in all honesty, the only area that I'm super concerned with is the very top portion of our risers. That's because we're still going to be painting these risers. Yes, I am still going to be using some paint on this project just because I want to have a nice contrast between the red brick and the white risers. If I don't like the white risers long term, I can always apply this brick veneer to it later on. But I want to try this method out first, and let me know what you think in the comment section, whether it was a good idea to paint these risers, or if you would prefer them to be the red brick veneer that we use for everything else. Once I was completely done with the grinding process, I did immediately start applying a couple layers of paint on the risers. This way I don't have to worry about the painting process whatsoever after the tile and grout is installed, and this way I don't have to worry about having perfect crisp lines everywhere because the brick is going to be covering up the vast majority of all the seams. After I let the paint dry, I then come back to it and we can proceed to doing some brick layout. In a perfect world, we can use all of these nosings without having to cut a single one, and apparently we actually live in this perfect world because after I had all these applied and used these 3/8 inch spacers, we didn't have to cut a single nosing to make it fit properly. We did have to do a slight adjustment at both ends, so both ends don't have a perfect 3/8 of an inch of grout, but all the other ones do, so that's pretty nice. With layout accounted for, we can now move on to thinset. The thinset I'm choosing to use on this project is the Pro Light by Custom. It's a very nice quality thinset and it can be used interiorly or exteriorly. That's the important part with thinset on a project like this, is to make sure that you're using a thinset that can be applied exteriorly, not just interiorly. With our thinset fully mixed, I then grab a damp sponge and wipe down the concrete. This is for a number of reasons. Number one, I want to remove any of the small particles that the shop vac didn't pick up, and two, and more importantly, is if you apply thinset directly to dry concrete, it seems to flash dry that thinset and you don't have much working time. If you apply a little bit of moisture to the surface first and then apply your thinset, then you're going to have a little longer of a working time, and that's important, especially since every single one of these brick noses needs to be hand buttered. As you can see, I'm applying a significant amount of thinset to these noses because I want to guarantee that there's no voids or issues with bonding strength, because as you can imagine, with the front steps of a house, this is going to get a significant amount of foot traffic, and with that foot traffic comes wear and tear. I want to make sure that these noses are as strong as possible. Plus, as you can kind of see right here, this concrete is not perfectly level, especially after all the grinding. So you have to fill those large voids at the very front of the lip, while also still making sure that the back side of the nose that's facing the door doesn't have too much thinset where it's oozing through our grout lines and becoming an issue and a mess. As I mentioned before, we don't have a perfect 3/8 of an inch thick grout line at the very tail end on both sides, but in my book that's just fine because we have full pieces that I feel are much more important in terms of look. With one row complete, we can move on to the next 3. Yeah, this is not the quickest process, but I did find actually buttering multiple at once and then going back and installing multiple at one time is a little bit more efficient than doing one by one by one. When it comes to cutting your bricks down to the appropriate size, or in this case, having to notch out a small corner, I'm using my grinder in this application with a diamond disc. This material is extremely easy to cut and notch with a diamond disc like this, but just know ahead of time it is messy. Later on in the video, I'll show the more preferred way of cutting without dust. Keep in mind that as I'm doing this, I'm also using a level or a very straight 2x4 to put pressure on all these bricks at once. So in theory, every single one of these bricks should align properly with the one adjacent to it. The bricks that I purchased don't come with any outside corners, so we did have to get a little creative at this very bottom location by applying a nosing along with a flat panel on the riser. With that installed, we can move on to the remaining nosings on this bottom step, and once all those are installed, we can move on to our flat veneer bricks. I could have installed these flat pieces a couple different ways, but I decided to go with applying a substantial amount of thinset just to the back side of the brick itself. Wasn't the fastest way to install these, but definitely effective, along with reducing the amount of mess that I had for cleanup purposes. In terms of pattern, I decided to go with a running bond pattern because not only does it look good, but it also reduces the amount of waste that I have when it comes time to cutting bricks. With these tight areas and parameters, we can only get so far with full brick pieces, but when we get to the very tail end of each row, we're going to have to start cutting these bricks down. I take my measurement, apply that measurement to the brick, and bring it over to my wet saw. A wet saw is extremely useful and very nice to have with any tile related project, which also includes bricks. Not only do you get an extremely straight, accurate cut, but it also reduces the amount of dust greatly, if not eliminate it completely. The back row of bricks does have to be cut in half, but I'm able to use both halves, which is very nice and much more waste conscious. And again, by utilizing a wet saw, I'm able to eliminate the vast majority of the dust, while also still being extremely accurate with cutting, which of course is very important since these pieces are going to be right next to each other. If you are interested in checking out more about this brick or any of the tools or materials seen in this video, as always, I'll make sure and leave a link for those products in the description box below to make it easy for you. This is from Mutual Materials, and the color itself is called Inca. This is their slim brick product, and they come in multiple colors to choose from. Now, I know Mutual Materials is readily available here in the Pacific Northwest, but I don't know about nationwide, so I will provide multiple options that may be easier for you to get if you are purchasing from a large box store or Amazon. With all of our steps fully installed and taken care of, we can finally move on to our landing, and our landing is going to be a little bit different. Since this is at the front of my house and going to be the very first thing people see when they come to the front door, I want to make sure and put a little bit of extra effort and attention to this space with a herringbone pattern versus a running bond pattern. A running bone pattern is definitely going to be easier to install, but a herringbone pattern will provide a much more aesthetically pleasing look, in my opinion. My first step was to get the center point of our landing and then grab my framing square to make sure that I have a line that is perfectly perpendicular to my stair nosing. Once I wipe down the concrete and apply a layer of thinset, we're ready to start laying our brick veneer, and that line is so important that I drew on the concrete that I also brought in my laser level to pinpoint and make sure that the tip of our herringbone pattern is lined up with that line perfectly. Once aligned somewhat close to where we want it, it's time for spacers. These are brick veneer spacers that are specifically designed for this type of brick because they're left embedded into the thinset and you're not going to be removing these after they're laid. You can get these in multiple thicknesses, but in our scenario, since we already used 3/8 inch spacers on our nosing, we're going to be consistently using a 3/8 inch up here as well. As for the pattern, this is technically called a diagonal herringbone because you have these pointy arrows technically headed towards the house versus if you rotated it another 90 degrees, it would be a more traditional herringbone. Just keep that in mind and know that there's multiple patterns to choose from. The key element with this layout is consistency and spacing, and that's why these spacers are so nice to have because they're 3-sided, and that means they'll always be in contact with 3 tiles at any given time, which makes the layout process even easier. But as we make our way to areas where we're actually going to need to cut the tiles, I might get as simple and straightforward as possible. Bring the tile over to the area, then eyeball exactly where I want the tile to end, make the mark on the tile itself, strike a line, and get it cut to the appropriate size. I install these tiles just as I did all the rest, just making sure that each one is slightly back buttered before I apply it into the thinset. And with that, the only tedious part is to know that a lot of these pieces are going to be cut at different angles and sizes. Now, some of them might be fairly close to the one right next to it, but they are going to be all slightly different, most likely. Just try and be patient through this process because it is tedious to do all these shapes and sizes, but it's going to pay off in dividends in the end. And with that said, I want to say a huge and special thank you to the BYOT family. We are getting close to 500,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is quite impressive and exciting in my book that I don't take for granted, especially with the fact that I get to do what I love for a living, in part thanks to you actually watching and supporting. Please make sure you're subscribed to the channel because we have a lot in store for us this year, and I'm so excited to be sharing with you some larger plans for the future. And with that said, let's get back to the project and applying my last and final brick, which of course is a little bit more unique and tedious. Luckily for me, the wet saw makes quick and easy work of some of those more weird tight-knit areas, and we are now done with our brick. Now this was the very first time that I used these spacers, and it was really nice. Very even coverage as far as spacing goes, made it super simple to get this herringbone pattern, which is not simple to begin with. Just know that these are now embedded into the thinset and there's no way of getting them back, so one-time use. I did let the thinset dry overnight and came back to it the next day. Of course, there are a few miscellaneous spots I need to clean up, which is very easy with some type of wire brush, and if there's any heavier duty buildup, then a flathead screwdriver comes in handy. With our tiles cleaned up, it's now time for grout, and for grout, we're using a Polyblend Plus by Custom. This is a sanded grout, and it is also a product that can be used interiorly and exteriorly, which is very important. Once mixed to the right consistency, we can start applying it directly to our brick. As I did previously, I do wet down the bricks first in order to prevent our grout from flash drying to the very tops of our bricks. Once applied, we're ready for grout, and I'm just going to be using a standard grout float to try and squeeze this grout into those cracks and crevices as easy and straightforward as possible. One key note here, and the reason why I went with a sanded grout, is because you're generally going to be able to use a sanded grout with larger gaps. The grout that I'm using is designed for crevices that are between an 1/8 inch to a 1/2 inch, and since the vast majority of our grout lines are 3/8 of an inch, we are good to go. The application is obviously straightforward, and the cleaning is straightforward as well. The problem is the time it takes to clean grout off of brick like this, because it's not a clear, smooth surface like a porcelain tile. Brick is just naturally more porous, and therefore trying to get all this grout off of the tile was time consuming. Multiple sponges and buckets of water were used in this application, and as you can see here firsthand, it is a slow process just to remove that excess grout. But it is quite satisfying to see the end finish once you start removing that grout completely. If I did this again, I probably would have applied some type of sealer to the brick first before I applied the grout, just to make sure there was some type of barrier between the two, so it would at least be slightly easier to remove the grout from the top surface of the brick. Now, sponge washing might be something that sounds fun in a retirement home, but cross-contamination is something I think about even in the sponge game. I pre-wash the sponge in the dirty bucket, then I go back to the second bucket, dip it in the water, but I don't rinse it out in that bucket. I rinse out the water into the first bucket, so I leave the second bucket as clean as possible. Also, as a general reminder, I did completely wash out both buckets numerous times because at a certain point, no matter what, both buckets are going to be filthy dirty. When it comes to the vertical crevices on the front of our noses, those are a little bit more unique because they don't have a flush bottom to them. That means I want to make sure that the bottoms themselves are compacted, which is why I actually take my fingers and compact that grout just slightly at every single bottom grout line location. But other than that, the same parameters apply by applying the grout and wiping it off thoroughly, which will take multiple applications. And as a general side note or pro tip, make sure you're working from the top down. There's plenty of excess grout that falls off, especially when you get to the vertical areas, but that just falls onto the one below it, which you can then fill as needed. With all of our steps fully grouted now, it's time for some haze remover. There's still plenty of grout haze on the bricks even after all that washing, so I do make sure and dilute the solution and apply that to the top surfaces of the bricks themselves. I do this 2 times to make sure that all that haze is completely removed, so we have a perfect, beautiful finish in the end. Now, if you do feel like you have just too much haze that's not being removed properly, you can always do a concrete acid etching, which could clean up the bricks to your desired look, or just apply a sealer to the mix and you'll have a nice looking brick for years to come. But with the haze removed, we are now completely done with this amazing, beautiful transformation. I absolutely love how this project turned out, and I do really like the white. But let me know in the comment section, what do you think of the white below, and would you put brick on that? It certainly looks better than what was here originally, but no matter whether you like the white or not, it is truly one beautiful, sexy beast of a front patio walkway now. Oh yeah,